Hi, and welcome to our practice exam for exam 2. In this one, we are going to cover modules 3 through 5 in preparation for the exam. Just as always, when you get to a new slide, there will be blue dots that come up, and I want you to immediately click those. That will stop the video, and those will be those practice exam questions. If you get the answer wrong, which is beneficial probably to click on it, the wrong answer, so that it will tell you where to go back in the module to really get familiar with that content. So there will be games that it'll direct you to, videos to watch, or just module content in general to go back to. Once you go back there, if you still aren't feeling confident or you're confused about something, that is when you need to reach out to me so we can talk about that content. So we will be covering all 3 of those modules. And if you after you're done with the question, you let the video play, I will review that content briefly, but if you want more, you have to go back to the module content. So the first thing we're going to start in module 3 is the pathomechanics of bone. So for bone, these are the fractures, so the fracture types. And so when you look at this image, I want you to be able to look down at the image and identify what kind of fracture it is. The first one on the upper left is our green stick fracture, where when a young child has the periosteum intact, so when you go to bend it, the outer layer stays in contact, but the other side breaks where that tension was. The middle one on the top is a fissure fracture, and then you have a comminuted fracture, which is in pieces, which happens more in an adult than a child. And then on the bottom left, we have a transverse, which is straight through. And then the middle bottom is an oblique fracture. And then on that bottom right is a spiral fracture where it twists around from a torsion type injury. When we think about pathomechanics of fractures, this is where we talk about what mechanisms typically lead to what fracture patterns and the differences between child and adult. What you really need to understand here is that for a child, a bending or a torsion injury, where it's like bending or twisting, is typically going to result in a green stick fracture. So we're talking about that bending or torsion, where it's basically going to stay intact on one side. So the periosteum is very strong. So one side typically always stays intact, and then it acts as a hinge, and the other side breaks. That's a green stick fracture, where an adult probably is going to get a spiral fracture going up like a normal bone that's hard, where the collagen in the child's bone is going to make that stick and stay in there in that periosteum. And then a tension type injury where it's pulling, so like a muscle pulling on a bone, that would give us a strain in an adult, a muscle strain, but in a child it's going to do an avulsion fracture, where the muscle leads into a tendon, attaches on the apophysis, and pulls that off. So that is what we're thinking about when we think about a tension type injury. When we're looking at the actual pathomechanics of a bone and the makeup of a bone, we have our cortical bone on the outside, which is very stiff and withstands stress, where a trabecular bone is very porous and it's spongier and it withstands more strain. If you remember with stress and strain, is that stress means it takes a really high impact, high energy, and it's not going to bend before it breaks, it's just going to break. So it's going to take a big macro trauma, a big energy to be able to break it, but the trabecular bone is going to be able to bend a little bit. So it's going to take a lot of strain, a lot of little micro traumas can bend and bend and bend before it finally deforms. So keeping in mind of the inner versus the outer part of the bone, where the outer part is that cortical, more stiffer bone, withstands more stress, trabecular bone withstanding more strain. Also, when we think of bone and resisting forces, so the bone itself is strongest in resisting compression forces versus shearing forces. So it's the weakest at resisting shearing, which is forces coming from opposite sides and causing a break that way. So bones are weakest at resisting the shearing force, but the actual compression force, it's the strongest. So understanding those concepts are important. And then where does growth take place in the bone? So the periosteum is the outer layer. Throughout our entire lifetime, it's going to build circumferentially and build out, where the actual longitudinal growth that makes us longer and taller, and our arms longer, our legs longer, is going to be occurring in our epiphyseal plates, which are the end of long bones, and they close about 14 to 16-year-old in females and about 18 to 21 in males. And this Once those growth plates close, there is no more longitudinal growth, but our circumferential growth keeps growing throughout our life, and it's happening in the periosteum. Remember, it's absorbed in the medullary cavity in the inner part, but it's building the osteoblastic, the B for blasting, building bone, is going to be on the outer part of that bone in the periosteum. Transitioning to module 4, where we have the joints. So there's 6 different types of synovial joints, and we have the ball and socket joint. You need to be able to look at these and identify what kind of joint it is in the body. So an example of it in the body. So a ball and socket joint would be like glenohumeral in the shoulder or femoral acetabular in the hip. And then the condyloid joint is where we're talking about our second through our fifth metacarpal joints, or then our metatarsal in our feet. And then our gliding joints are our little circular irregular bones here in our carpal bones or in our tarsal bones in our foot, where they actually just shift on each other. And then our hinge joint is our ulnar humeral joint, where we're flexing and extending. And then also our tibiofemoral joint in our knee, which is flexing and extending. Pivot joint is, there's not many of those in the body, but an example would be our radial ulnar. So it's where the radius is like a disc and it's just rotating on the ulnar joint, on the ulna bone. And then our saddle joint is our CMC joint down here, carpometacarpal joint, where it sits almost like a horse saddle. When we look at the synovial joint in itself, so there's different structures in a synovial joint that makes it unique to itself. So we have our capsule on the outside. You need to be able to look at this image and identify what these different structures are, while also knowing the definition of each. So if there was a matching question, you would know the structures and also the definitions of them. So the capsule is going to be like the balloon on the outside that's going to enclose the synovial fluid in the whole joint. And the synovial fluid is going to nourish the rest of all of the structures within the synovial joint. And then you have tendons and muscles, tendon and ligaments. So tendons, are muscles that connect muscle to bone. So we have tendons and then we have ligaments. Ligaments connect bone to bone. You also have bursas, there's fluid-filled sacs and high friction areas. And then you have 2 different types of cartilage. It's really important to understand these 2 different types of cartilage. This will definitely come up on the exam. You need to understand the difference between the 2. Articular cartilage, as I've said before, articular is an articulation, which is another word for joint. So we have articular joint cartilage, which lines the bones, and then fibrocartilage, which cushions between bones, which is the meniscus, the labrum, and intervertebral disc. So knowing the difference between those and all of the other structures of a synovial joint. There's also stabilization. What provides stabilization to a joint? So understanding there are dynamic and there are static stabilizers. Dynamic stabilizers are the stabilization, the structures that are providing stability while we're moving. And static stabilizers are the structures that are providing stability while we're standing still. Static stabilizers are always going to be bone because the shape of the bone and the shape of the joint is never going to change. Where the dynamic stabilizers are muscle, and those are also never going to change. They're always going to be providing that movement, the stability while we're moving. Ligaments and capsules roles can vary depending on the joint, but because the joints can change, and this class isn't super high level in graduate school, I'm not going to ask you about those structures. So when they're asking you about a particular joint and asking which one is a dynamic stabilizer, you need to be looking for the muscle. And a static stabilizer, you need to be looking for the bone. Another element that is providing stabilization to a joint is a sensory motor system. So it's essential to that functional joint stability. So there are certain mechanoreceptors in different structures. So the muscle spindles are located in muscles. The Golgi tendon organs are found in tendons. And then the non-Golgi tendon organs are found in ligaments. And I think of it as ligaments and tendons are very similar. So we have Golgi tendon organs and then non-tendon organs. So think about that for ligament is non-Golgi tendon. And then Ruffini endings and Pacini and corpuscles are actually located in the capsule and the skin. All of these send signals back to the brain. So the brain's signaling, we're moving this way, everyone tighten up on this side. And then the muscle spindles send a signal, we're to the brain and we're contracting the muscle. So that is a system that is also provides stability and understanding what mechanoreceptor, what it's called per structure. Additionally, when you look at all of these joint injuries, having an idea of what the different joint injuries are. So the first one all the way to the left, we have a joint dislocation. So it's when the bone is no longer articulating with the joint surface, so it's completely removed. And then right next to it on the bottom right, we have what's called a subluxation. So it's either partially in the joint or it went out completely and then went back into place. Both of those are called subluxations. And then next to it, where we see pieces missing from the end of a bone, that is the articular cartilage. And when pieces are missing, that is osteoarthritis. And then we have the bursa sac, that is really inflamed and angry and red, and that is bursitis. It can be inflamed when there's too much friction or it's angry or they fell on it. And then next to that is a ligament with a red mark through it. So that's the MCL, the medial collateral ligament of the knee. And if there is a red mark there, it's indicating injury to that, which is a sprain. So sprains are injuries that happen to the joint that happen specifically to the ligaments. Transitioning to Module 5, which is about the pathomechanics of muscle, we really need to understand the properties that make it unique. So what really makes it unique is its ability to build tension. It can build tension from a stimuli, so it's irritable, it has irritability, so it can then respond to a stimulus and develop tension. That tension allows it to have strength and power and torque and all of those things that are unique to a muscle. Extensibility is its ability to be stretched, but its elasticity, like an elastic rubber band, is to be able to return back to its normal shape. So knowing those different properties. For a contraction, understanding the different muscle contractions and the different, how the muscles play different roles. So when we're talking about here with our biceps, so if I'm talking about the movement is elbow flexion. So the primary mover here that is shortening and concentrically contracting, so a concentric contraction is shortening of the muscle. So the primary mover is the biceps right here. It is shortening to be able to flex the elbow. Conversely, on the other side, this is going to be our triceps, which is eccentrically contracting, which is lengthening. So the primary mover, the muscle that is shortening in that motion, is the agonist. So in elbow flexion, the agonist is the biceps, and the antagonist, which is eccentrically contracting on the other side, is the triceps. And then let's change motions, and now we're doing elbow extension. Elbow extension, the primary mover is the triceps. It is now shortening, concentrically contracting to extend the elbow. And the biceps is now lengthening and eccentrically contracting to extend the elbow. Isometric contraction is when we're contracting all of our muscles, our antagonists and our agonists at the same time, and there's no movement happening at the joint. So ensuring we understand all of those definitions and how they're at play with joint movement. And then also understanding the different types of muscle injury. So we have a spasm, which is coming from electrolyte imbalance. So we're a decrease in sodium, usually from dehydration. And so because of that imbalance, the muscle contracts and is stiff. We can usually replenish and try to change that electrolyte balance to make it more balanced. But you can also stretch and ice in the meantime to get the spasm to stop, and then you have to fix the electrolyte imbalance in order to not get the spasm again. The middle picture is a tear in the muscle, which is a muscle strain. So I try to think of strain versus sprain, and a strain as a T, and a muscle goes into tendon, so tendon strain, if that helps you at all. And then the last one is rhabdomyolysis, and it's when there's such a severe breakdown in the muscle, typically from a major crush injury or electrocution, but it can happen from significant eccentric contractions. And something like perhaps CrossFit has a bad reputation for some people getting this because they do so many repetitions beyond what they should. So if they're not in physical condition for it or they're really dehydrated, they are at risk for doing rhabdomyolysis, where the muscle breaks down so much that it poisons the blood and components of the muscle go into the bloodstream. Understanding too that there is something unique about two joint muscles, so muscles that go across two joints. So one is our hand muscles that flex our hand. They also flex our wrists, and so they extend past the elbow, and then they go into the hand. So something to understand is active insufficiency and passive insufficiency. So for active insufficiency, if we're activating the flexor, so we flex the wrist, we can then not fully flex the finger muscles because we have active insufficiency. But if we go back to neutral and we flex the wrist and we try bending, we're not going to be able to fully flex the wrist. So this is, you think of a muscle, and when it's contracting, it can't contract then fully over two joints. So understanding that active insufficiency and how that could affect us if we're trying to contract muscles over two different joints. And then the final thing is our rehabilitative healing phases. And just understand there's 4 phases whenever something is torn and we have an injury or a wound or for, whatever. But in this rehabilitative kind of area, we're going to be talking about actual healing process to a torn ligament or a torn muscle, but mainly like a ligaments, joint type of injuries or muscle injuries. When we're looking at those, we have inflammation, proliferation, early and late remodel. And it's important for you to understand what is happening in each of those areas so that you can understand kind of how rehab and things are applied to that. So inflammation is typically the first 24 to potentially 72 hours, depending on the extent of the injury and where it's happening. And so that is where all the good cells are rushing in to clean it out and taking all the bad stuff out. And then proliferation is where we're laying down that granular tissue, we're laying down that type 3 weak collagen to be able to provide, some stability. But this is a really dangerous spot to be in because as you, like someone out of ACL rehab, about 6 weeks out, they're feeling really good, but they have predominantly type 3 collagen. It's very weak. So that's why they can't just go out and do 300-pound squats or go out and run full speed with a lot of agility because they don't have the collagen there to provide that pre-injury tensile strength. So then we move to early remodel over time, and that early remodel starts replacing all the type 3 collagen with type 1 collagen, which provides more stability there. And then we can start testing and getting closer return to sport. And then we get to late remodel, which we can do return to sport type of activities. And we should be at pre-injury tensile strength before performing those activities so that we can really push the body to get to the point where they were better and more prepared than pre-injury status. As you go through that, make sure you're highlighting all the areas that you struggled with or got wrong, and go back and take the time to play those games, watch the videos, and read the module content. And if you're still having questions, please reach out. Good luck.